August 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The transport train carrying 89 German women pulled into the station under oppressive southern heat. These women, officially designated in Wehrmacht records as Lagerbordell personnel, had spent an average of 37 months in military brothel facilities before liberation by American forces in Bavaria during April and May 1945. Helga Richter, age 24, stepped off the train expecting continuation of nightmare in different form. She had been conscripted into brothel service at 21 through the Labor Office's Alternative Service Program after a black market conviction. Wehrmacht propaganda about American brutality had filled mandatory weekly sessions for 3 years. What she encountered would lead her to write words that American censors flagged and preserved. "This place they call a prison is more freedom than I knew in Germany before the war." Across 11 prisoner of war camps in the American South and Midwest between June 1945 and March 1947, 1,247 German women from military brothel facilities would experience institutional environment so contrary to their previous existence that numerous women in preserved correspondence described it as paradise compared to what we knew, and better than Germany before the war. The question of how imprisonment could feel like liberation reveals depths of prior exploitation while documenting one of war's most unusual psychological operations. If you want to hear more incredible untold stories from American military history that challenge everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're watching from. It's amazing to see how these forgotten stories still resonate today. The Nazi military brothel system operated with bureaucratic precision that generated comprehensive documentation now preserved in captured Wehrmacht administrative files. Ministry of Interior records recovered from Berlin show that between 1940 and 1945, approximately 34,000 German women were processed through this system, with 9,400 serving in facilities on German territory by war's end. These were not the better documented forced prostitution facilities using occupied populations, but rather a parallel system exploiting German women through economic coercion, legal manipulation, and direct conscription. Recruitment methods followed documented patterns. Labor Office records from Munich and Hamburg show that between 1942 and 1944, approximately 6,700 women were transferred from civilian criminal sentences into military brothel service through legal provision, allowing alternative service for moral rehabilitation. Women convicted of prostitution-related offenses, black market activities, or morality violations faced choices between prison terms or contracted service in military facilities. The contracts, preserved in Justice Ministry archives, specified 2-year minimum service with wages deposited to blocked accounts, accessible only after satisfactory completion of service. Additional recruitment occurred through economic desperation. Women's labor service records show 2,200 women accepted brothel contracts after losing factory employment. The differential was stark. Unemployed women received 800 calories daily through ration cards, while brothel workers received 2,400 calories plus room and board. For women with dependent children, this was not choice but forced decision between survival and starvation. The most disturbing category involved direct conscription. Gestapo files from Stuttgart and Frankfurt document 340 cases where women deemed asocial or work-shy were directly assigned to brothel facilities without judicial process. These assignments, authorized under emergency labor mobilization decrees, created population of women who were prisoners in all but name. The facilities operated under Wehrmacht administrative control with regulations treating occupants as military property. Facility inspection reports from 1943 and 1944 document the systematization. Typical facility housed 1,530 women in barracks-style buildings with rooms measuring approximately 8 by 10 feet. Medical inspections occurred twice weekly, conducted by military doctors who treated women as disease vectors rather than patients. Women showing signs of pregnancy or venereal disease were immediately transferred or returned to civilian prisons. Working conditions were documented with bureaucratic precision. Facility regulations specified each woman would be available 6 days weekly, 8 hours daily. Actual implementation varied, with some women reporting in later testimonies that during heavy troop rotation, quotas reached 15 to 20 soldiers per day. Payment systems existed, but functioned as debt bondage mechanisms. Women earned theoretical wages but faced deductions for room, board, medical care, clothing, and administrative fees, consuming 80–90% of nominal earnings. The psychological conditioning was systematic. Facility regulations required weekly morale sessions where supervisors reinforced messages about duty, temporary service nature, and resistance consequences. More insidiously, conditioning included explicit warnings about Allied soldiers, particularly Americans. Propaganda materials recovered from liberated facilities included pamphlets describing American soldiers as racially mixed degenerates whose treatment would make Wehrmacht facilities seem benign. These materials served dual purposes, maintaining control through fear while preemptively discrediting any claims of better treatment under Allied occupation. The decision to transfer liberated women to American POW camps rather than immediate repatriation reflected multiple policy considerations. Europe in summer 1945 faced displaced persons crisis of unprecedented scale. German infrastructure lay in ruins, with major cities experiencing 40–60% housing shortages and food availability at starvation levels. The vulnerability of brothel facility women, stigmatized, lacking family networks, at risk of re-exploitation, led military government planners to conclude transfer to secure American facilities provided better outcomes. War Department memorandum dated May 15, 1945 from Provost Marshal General's Office outlined policy. German female personnel liberated from Wehrmacht brothel facilities represent special category requiring protective custody and rehabilitation. Transfer to CONUS POW facilities authorized for up to 18 months pending German stabilization. These personnel will receive protected person status under Geneva Convention Article 4, B.2, with treatment standards equivalent to female civilian internees rather than combatant POWs. The classification as protected persons carried specific implications. They could not be compelled to perform labor, though voluntary work would be compensated. They would receive civilian clothing rather than prisoner uniforms. They would have unrestricted correspondence privileges with postage provided. They would not be subject to military discipline, but rather administrative procedures appropriate for civilians. Most significantly, they would be housed separately from male POWs, supervised by female personnel, with male guards restricted to external perimeter security. The first group of 127 women arrived at Camp Ruston on June 18, 1945. The women's section comprised 4 wooden barracks buildings housing 35 women each, central dining hall, medical clinic, recreation building, and administrative offices. The entire section was surrounded by single fence, with guard towers staffed 24 hours, but guards were instructed their function was protection, not custody, preventing unauthorized entry rather than restricting internal movement. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, commanding officer and Women's Army Corps officer, filed initial assessment preserved in National Archives. Women arrived in adequate physical condition following 3 months European processing. Medical screening showed continued improvement from liberation, average 12 pounds weight gain since April, resolution of acute malnutrition, ongoing treatment for chronic conditions. Psychological state more complex. Women exhibit hypervigilance, excessive compliance, difficulty understanding they have choices about daily activities. When shown quarters and told they would not be locked in at night, several asked repeatedly when lockdown would actually occur. First meal service revealed expectation of minimal rations. Women attempted to hoard food until staff explained 3 full meals daily would continue indefinitely. Trust in institutional statements extremely low, requiring behavioral demonstration rather than verbal assurance. The camp routine differed substantially from standard POW protocols. Daily schedule included 0600, 0700 wake and personal preparation, no formal reveille required. 0700 0800 breakfast service, cafeteria style with choices. 0800 1200 morning period with optional activities, including vocational training, English instruction, recreation, or voluntary work assignments. 1200 1300 lunch. 1300 1700 afternoon optional activities. 1700 1800 dinner. 1800 2200 evening free time with access to recreation facilities, library, craft rooms. 2200 suggested lights out, not enforced. The emphasis on optional participation reflected deliberate rehabilitation strategy. Captain Margaret Chen, camp psychologist, submitted monthly assessments. These women experienced years of every decision made for them, every moment controlled, their bodies treated as property. Rehabilitation requires rebuilding capacity for autonomous decision-making. Camp programming emphasizes voluntary participation and multiple options. Initial responses show difficulty with this freedom. Many repeatedly ask for orders, seek permission for routine activities, appear anxious about choosing. Progress measured by increasing comfort with choice and decreasing requests for instruction. Vocational training programs provided practical skills and psychological benefits. Camp Ruston offered typing and shorthand instruction, with 67 women enrolling by July. English language classes at multiple levels, with 94% enrollment by August. Sewing and tailoring instruction, 43 participants, cooking and baking classes, 38 participants, and basic accounting and bookkeeping, 29 participants. Instructor evaluations document engagement. Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, civilian typing instructor, wrote in September 1945, "Students demonstrate exceptional motivation. Attendance is 97% for enrolled students, many requesting additional practice time. Several achieved 45 to 50 words per minute after just 10 weeks. When I asked why they work so intensely, one stated, 'This skill means I can support myself. I will never be dependent on anyone's exploitation again.'" Classes function as more than job training. They represent reclamation of future possibilities. English language program generated notable outcomes. Professor James Wilson administered quarterly proficiency test. His December 1945 assessment reported, of 119 women enrolled, proficiency distribution shifted from 23% beginner 54%, intermediate 23%, advanced initially to 8% beginner 34%, intermediate 58%, advanced after 6 months. Exceptional progress attributable to high motivation and intensive study. When asked why English proficiency matters given eventual German repatriation, responses consistently emphasized that English represents opportunity, that American language connects to values of individual rights and rule of law they experienced here. The voluntary work program offered agency and purpose. Women could work in camp laundry, kitchen, beautification, or clerical support. Work was compensated at $0.80 daily, paid in scrip redeemable at camp canteen for personal items, toiletries, and small luxuries. Employment records show 73% elected to work within first month, rising to 84% by 3 months. Camp canteen purchasing records provide insight into psychological adjustment. Initial purchases concentrated on necessities: soap, toothpaste, writing paper. By 3 months, patterns shifted towards small luxuries: chocolate, magazines, cosmetics, decorative items. The shift from survival orientation to comfort-seeking indicated psychological normalization. Living conditions exceeded their previous institutional experiences. Barracks were wooden structures with insulated walls, electric heating, screened windows. Each woman had individual bed with mattress, pillow, sheets changed weekly, and wool blankets. Personal storage consisted of wooden locker and foot locker. Buildings had electric lighting and passed weekly cleanliness inspections. Washing facilities represented significant upgrade. Communal bathhouses contained individual shower stalls with privacy curtains, hot water available daily or 600 to 100. Toilets in individual stalls, sinks with mirrors and adequate lighting, and laundry facilities for personal items. These accommodations, standard for American military facilities, represented luxury for women whose previous environments had treated privacy as irrelevant. Medical care exceeded both previous experience and pre-war German civilian availability. Each camp had fully equipped clinics staffed by female doctors and nurses, dental services, pharmacy with full medication range, and protocols for transferring patients requiring specialized care to civilian hospitals at government expense. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, Chief Medical Officer at Camp Ruston, filed quarterly health reports. Her December 1945 report stated, patient population shows continued improvement across all metrics. Average weight gain from arrival to 6 months. 14.3 pounds, bringing most women to healthy range. Resolution of malnutrition indicators. Vitamin deficiencies corrected in 94%. Anemia resolved in 87%. Menstrual regularity restored in 79%, previously showing amenorrhea. Dental treatment completion. 68% of identified needs addressed. Psychological assessment shows decreased anxiety in 76%, improved sleep in 82%, and development of future orientation in 69%. These outcomes reflect adequate nutrition, safe environment, appropriate medical intervention, and psychological support working synergistically. The food service provided daily nutrition far exceeding both brothel experience and contemporary German civilian availability. Camp mess records document daily menus. Breakfast typically including eggs, toast, butter, jam, coffee with milk and sugar, fruit when available, totaling 600 to 700 calories. Lunch featuring soup, sandwich, or hot entree, vegetable dessert, totaling 700 to 800 calories. Dinner comprising meat, 2 vegetables, bread, dessert, beverage, totaling 900 to 1,000 calories. Total daily average 2,400 calories, matching standard displaced person rations and exceeding German civilian rations of 1,100 to 1,500 calories. Food quality became frequent subject in letters home. Statistical analysis of 847 letters from Camp Ruston during July-December 1945, conducted by Army Intelligence and preserved in psychological warfare files, found 89% mentioned food quality or quantity, with 67% making specific comparisons to German conditions. Representative excerpts: we eat 3 times daily with meat and vegetables and even desserts. More food than I saw in Germany in 1944 entire year. Yesterday we had roast chicken with potatoes and green beans and apple pie. I cannot remember last time I ate chicken before the war. Correspondence privileges exceeded those available to standard POWs. Regulations permitted unlimited letter writing with no restrictions on recipients beyond Axis nations still at war. Postage was provided at camp expense. Letters were censored only for military security information, not personal content. Women could receive unlimited incoming mail and packages, with contents inspected for contraband but otherwise unrestricted. The letters generated extraordinary intelligence value. Military intelligence recognized this and adjusted censorship accordingly. June 1945 memo from War Department's Psychological Warfare Division stated, "Letters from protected person facilities represent optimal propaganda, authentic, credible, transmitted through personal networks rather than official channels, arriving at target audience without apparent government sponsorship. Recommend minimal censorship to preserve authenticity. These letters undermine Nazi propaganda and Soviet agitation more effectively than official information programs." Content analysis revealed consistent themes. October 1945 analysis covering 2,347 letters identified. Positive treatment statements in 94%, specific mention of adequate food in 87%, references to medical care quality in 76%, expressions of safety and security in 71%. Favorable comparisons to German conditions in 68%, statements that Nazi propaganda about Americans was false in 43%, and requests that recipients share information with community members in 34%. One preserved letter from Helga Richter to her aunt in Hamburg stated, "Aunt Gertrude, I write to tell you I am safe and better cared for than I have been in 5 years. The Americans call this a prison camp, but I have more freedom here than I knew in Hamburg before conscription. We choose how to spend our days. We learn skills. We eat food that makes me remember what health feels like. The guards stay outside the fence and exist to protect us, not control us. When I was sick last month, American doctors treated me with medicines and care that cost me nothing. Yesterday I used money I earned from voluntary work to buy chocolate and a magazine. These small choices, what to study, what to eat from options, what to purchase with my own money, feel like enormous freedoms after years of every decision made for me. If you can, tell others that Americans treat even us with dignity." Family responses to these letters created ripple effects. Army's mail monitoring in occupied Germany tracked correspondence patterns. December 1945 analysis noted, letters from protected person camps in U.S. are being shared widely in recipient communities. Secondary and tertiary distribution estimated at 12-15 readers per letter beyond primary recipient. Content is being cited in conversations monitored through informant networks. German civilians increasingly reference these letters as evidence contradicting Soviet propaganda about American treatment. The authentic testimony appears more persuasive than official information programs. Recreational and cultural activities reflected recognition that rehabilitation required more than physical care. Camp Ruston's recreation program included library with German and English books, magazines, newspapers, craft room with sewing, knitting, painting supplies, music room with piano, phonograph, records, sports equipment for volleyball, badminton, organized movie nights, and holiday celebrations for Christmas, Easter, and German traditional holidays. Christmas 1945 at Camp Ruston was documented through Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's report and preserved photographs. Camp administration provided Christmas trees, decorating supplies, special holiday meals, and small gifts for each woman. Women organized their own celebration incorporating German traditions, with choir singing traditional carols, decoration in German style, and exchange of handmade gifts. Morrison's report captured emotional significance. Christmas celebration revealed depth of psychological transformation. Women organized complex social activities requiring cooperation, planning, leadership, capabilities suppressed during brothel exploitation. Celebration incorporated German cultural traditions freely without requirement to adopt American practices, demonstrating camp environment allows cultural identity expression. Most significantly, multiple women commented this was their first real Christmas in years, meaning first where they felt safe enough to experience joy rather than merely surviving. One stated, in the brothel, holidays were worse times because soldiers had leave and quotas increased. Here, holidays are actually holidays. The comparison reveals psychological distance traveled. Religious services provided another dimension of freedom. Camp regulations required providing access per Geneva Convention. Camp Ruston brought in civilian clergy from local German-speaking Lutheran and Catholic churches for weekly services. Attendance was voluntary, with 64% attending some services and 34% attending regularly. Chaplain reports documented psychological function beyond spiritual needs. Father Hermann Müller, German-American priest conducting Catholic services, wrote in December 1945, "These women's relationship with faith has been severely damaged. Many express anger at God for abandonment, shame making them feel unworthy of religious participation, or loss of faith entirely. The opportunity to attend services represents more than religious practice. It represents reclamation of moral identity and community belonging." Several stated that being welcomed in church despite their past represents first experience of unconditional acceptance. Camp's provision of religious freedom, without compulsion but with genuine access, allows rebuilding relationship with faith at their own pace. Educational programming extended beyond vocational training to cultural and intellectual enrichment. Camp Ruston offered American history and government classes, 42 participants, world geography and current events discussions, 38 participants, literature discussion groups covering German, American, and world literature, 29 participants, and art appreciation sessions, 31 participants. American government classes generated particular interest. Professor Thomas Weber, German-American political science professor, reported, "Students demonstrate intense curiosity about American political system, particularly concepts of individual rights, rule of law, democratic governance. Many explicitly contrast American constitutional protections with their experiences of German system, providing no protection from exploitation." One asked, "If American Constitution prohibits cruel punishment and requires due process, does that mean your system would not have permitted what happened to us?" The question led to profound discussion of how constitutional systems either protect or fail to protect vulnerable populations. The Camp Newsletter Project provided evidence of community formation. At Camp Ruston, women proposed creating monthly newsletter, Unser Leben, Our Life, with content in German. Camp administration approved with editorial independence granted except for security-sensitive content. First issue appeared August 1945 with subsequent monthly editions through repatriation. The newsletters contained articles about camp activities, resident profiles, poetry and creative writing, humor columns, recipes, advice columns, and community announcements. Evolution documented psychological progression. Early issues focused on practical information and camp news. Later issues included more creative content, humor, personal reflection, and future planning. The December 1945 Christmas issue editorial stated, "We began this year as exploited women without hope for future. We end it as students, workers, and community members planning for tomorrow. This transformation occurred not through our own strength alone, but through institutional environment that treated us as human beings worthy of dignity, safety, and opportunity." When we return to Germany, we carry not just skills and health, but knowledge that systems can exist which protect rather than exploit. Psychological counseling services address trauma using methods documented through clinical records. Each camp had psychologists or psychiatrists providing individual and group counseling voluntarily. Captain Margaret Chen at Camp Ruston established program documented through monthly reports. Chen's approach emphasized establishing safety as foundation. Her September 1945 report explained, "These women experienced complex trauma including sexual exploitation, institutional captivity, loss of agency, and systematic dehumanization." Treatment emphasizes establishing safety as foundation. Camp environment provides external safety through physical security, adequate resources, and absence of exploitation. Counseling helps build internal safety through processing trauma, developing coping strategies, and rebuilding sense of self as autonomous agent. Progress measured not primarily through symptom reduction, but through increased capacity for autonomous decision-making, future planning, and relationship formation. Group counseling sessions, attended voluntarily by 42% of residents, addressed common themes. Topics included processing anger at perpetrators, managing shame and self-blame, rebuilding trust, developing post-repatriation strategies, and addressing fears about return to Germany. Groups functioned as peer support networks persisting beyond formal sessions. Individual counseling records showed measurable outcomes through quarterly standardized assessments. December 1945 aggregate report covering 127 women at Camp Ruston showed 67% reduction in PTSD symptom severity from baseline, 54% reduction in depression symptoms, 43% reduction in anxiety symptoms, 78% increase in future orientation scores, 62% increase in self-efficacy scores, and 71% increase in trust in institution scores. The comparison between camp conditions and contemporary German civilian experiences created cognitive dissonance, appearing frequently in letters and conversations. By late 1945, occupied Germany faced severe conditions: housing shortages with millions homeless, food availability at near starvation levels in some zones, medical care limited by supply shortages, economic collapse with widespread unemployment, and psychological trauma across population. German civilians' letters to camp relatives provided information about home conditions, creating comparative knowledge. Intelligence analysis of incoming mail noted, letters from Germany describe severe deprivation, fear, uncertainty. Food shortages dominate correspondence. Employment scarcity, housing damage, and administrative chaos appear as consistent themes. The contrast between conditions described by German civilians and conditions experienced by protected persons in American camps is stark and widely recognized. Multiple women stated in counseling they have better conditions as prisoners in America than their families have as civilians in Germany. The repatriation planning began November 1945 as German infrastructure stabilized. War Department policy required preparing protected persons through information about German conditions, assistance locating family members, job placement support where possible, and reintegration counseling. At Camp Ruston, repatriation preparation began December 1945 with phased return scheduled early 1946 through fall 1946. Repatriation counseling addressed psychological challenges. Women expressed anxiety about return to devastated communities with uncertain housing and food, stigma associated with brothel service despite victimization, difficulty readjusting to German social structures after experiencing American openness, concerns about finding employment in collapsed economy, and remarkably, reluctance to leave camp environment where they felt safe and valued. Captain Chen's February 1946 report stated, many residents express ambivalence about returning. While wishing to reunite with families, they fear losing safety, structure, and opportunities found here. Several stated directly that camp life represents best period of their adult lives, not because captivity is desirable, but because systematic dignity and genuine care were previously unknown. This represents both success of our program and indictment of their previous experiences. Phased repatriation occurred between February 1946 and November 1946. Each departing woman received comprehensive discharge package, complete medical records, vocational training certificates, employment references from camp supervisors, $50 in occupation currency, clothing package including practical garments, and information about employment assistance and social services available through military government in Germany. The departure documentation reveals emotional complexity. Staff notes describe departures as bittersweet, with women expressing gratitude while showing anxiety about uncertain futures. Multiple women requested permission to correspond with staff, with many maintaining contact for years. The final newsletter from Camp Ruston, published October 1946, included farewell messages documenting residents' perspectives. One stated, "We came to this place as broken women expecting further breaking. We leave as students, workers, and survivors who learned that institutions can exist which heal rather than harm." The Americans called this a prison, but it gave us freedoms we had never known. We had choice about our days, safety in our nights, food that nourished, medical care that treated us as worthy patients, education that opened futures we could not previously imagine. When German civilians ask us about American captivity, we will tell truth. That prisoners in American camps live better than civilians in wartime Germany, better than we lived as so-called free women before conscription. The Army's Civil Affairs Division conducted limited outcome study in 1949, attempting to locate and assess 200 former protected persons. The study, based on German government records, military government employment files, and direct interviews with 73 located women, provided partial outcome data. Of 147 women located and assessed, 64% obtained stable employment, with 23% working for Allied occupation authorities, 18% in clerical positions, 12% in teaching or social services, and 11% in other skilled positions. The employment rate significantly exceeded general German female population's 47% unemployment. Family reunification showed 71% successfully reconnected with family, 18% established independent households, and 11% remained in institutional settings. Health outcomes showed 89% maintained healthy weight, 94% showed no malnutrition conditions, and 76% reported regular medical care access. Qualitative interviews provided deeper insight. Helga Richter, working as translator for American military government in Munich, stated in 1949, "The camp years gave me foundation to rebuild my life. I learned English, typing, bookkeeping. But more important, I learned I could make decisions, that my choices mattered, that institutions could protect rather than exploit. When I returned to Munich in 1946, the city was rubble and people were starving. I had skills that let me obtain work immediately with American authorities. My English and understanding of American administrative culture, both gained in camp, made me valuable. But deeper than skills, camp experience gave me confidence that I had worth, that I could shape my future. Without that psychological foundation, I might have fallen into exploitation through economic desperation. Many women did. I had alternative because Americans invested in rehabilitation. The program's influence on American military doctrine extended through subsequent conflicts. Department of Defense Directive 5215, issued 1952 and governing treatment of exploited civilian populations in occupied territories, incorporated language directly derived from protected person camp protocols. The directive specified that civilians subjected to sexual exploitation by enemy forces would receive protected status, would be segregated from general displaced persons processing, would receive priority medical and psychological care, and would be protected from retaliation or stigmatization. During Vietnam War, protocols for handling civilian populations subjected to Viet Cong exploitation drew on World War II experience. In Iraq and Afghanistan, programs addressing trafficking victims and gender-based violence survivors incorporated elements from protected person camp model, including separation from threatening populations, female supervision, trauma-informed care, and skill development emphasis. The Cold War propaganda value was recognized and exploited by American information services. As U.S.-Soviet competition intensified, testimonies from former protected persons provided authentic material contrasting American and Soviet treatment. State Department's Office of International Information collected testimonies from willing former residents between 1948 and 1952, using them in radio broadcasts to Eastern Europe and printed materials distributed in Soviet-occupied territories. A 1950 State Department memorandum explained, former protected persons provide credible witnesses to American humanitarian principles in practice. These women experienced both Nazi exploitation and American protection, giving them unique comparative knowledge. Their testimony that American captivity provided better conditions than German freedom under Nazi system powerfully contradicts Soviet propaganda about capitalist exploitation. Recommendation: continue cultivating these sources and disseminating their testimonies through all available channels. Academic study began in 1970s as archives opened. Dr. Robert Manning's 1982 dissertation analyzed the program using War Department records and 34 oral history interviews. Manning documented key elements: classification as protected persons, created legal framework for rehabilitation-focused treatment, emphasis on voluntary participation addressed psychological damage from forced exploitation, vocational and educational programming provided skills enabling economic independence, sustained safe environment allowed natural trauma recovery, augmented by counseling. Dr. Helen Morrison's 1991 study examined gender dimensions through feminist framework. Morrison's research, based on 847 personnel files and 67 oral histories, argued that while program achieved humanitarian success, its framing often portrayed women as passive victims requiring male protection rather than acknowledging their agency and resistance. However, actual program implementation emphasized women's autonomy and decision-making capacity. Helga Richter, who opened this account, lived until 2004 and gave final oral history interview in 2002 at age 81. The interview, preserved in Imperial War Museum collection, concluded, "I have lived nearly 60 years since leaving Camp Ruston. I raised children, worked meaningful career, experienced ordinary life's joys and sorrows, but those 18 months in Louisiana were foundational. They taught me I had worth as human being, that my choices mattered, that institutions could protect rather than exploit, that even enemies could be treated with dignity. I carried that knowledge through my life and tried to live accordingly, treating others with dignity, demanding institutional accountability, believing better systems are possible because I experienced one." If you asked me to describe paradise, I would not describe Camp Ruston. It was prison camp with barbed wire and guards. But if you asked when I learned that human society could be organized around dignity rather than exploitation, I would point to those months. The Americans showed me through actions, not words, that power could be constrained by rules, that vulnerability could be protected, and that enemies could be rehabilitated rather than destroyed. These lessons shaped everything that came after. The program's significance lies in demonstration that humane treatment of vulnerable enemy populations is achievable when institutional structures prioritize it. Success resulted from clear policies, consistent enforcement, adequate resources, appropriate staffing, and command emphasis on humanitarian principles alongside security objectives. The comparative perspective reveals importance. Other liberation circumstances resulted in continued exploitation, abandonment, or inadequate support. The American choice to classify these women as protected persons requiring rehabilitation created conditions enabling recovery and reintegration. The women who called American prison camps paradise on earth were not describing physical amenities, though nutrition, medical care, and housing exceeded their previous experience. They were describing psychological reality of living in an institutional environment, organized around human dignity rather than exploitation. That contrast, experienced daily through small interactions and structural protections, transformed their understanding of what human society could be. The multiplication of that transformation through 1,247 individuals extending to families and communities created ripples far exceeding immediate program scope. German civilians who learned through personal networks that American captivity provided better conditions than Nazi freedom reconsidered propaganda about American intentions. This historical program demonstrates that treatment of powerless populations becomes measure by which broader populations assess institutional character. The American choice to treat exploited enemy women with systematic dignity created authentic testimony more persuasive than any propaganda. The program succeeded because policies matched principles, enforcement was consistent, and outcomes validated claims about American values. Paradise on Earth remains aspirational for any human institution, but German women who had experienced systematic exploitation followed by systematic dignity accurately identified that relative to previous existence, an American prison camp organized around Geneva Convention principles represented transformation so profound it felt paradoxical, imprisonment that enabled freedom, captivity that restored agency, enemy custody that rebuilt humanity. That paradox reveals both depths of Nazi exploitation and possibilities of institutional commitment to human dignity, even in wartime.